So I want to stop and check roll as well. My goodness, what a start. So apologies for the technical difficulties. So I finished grading the unit question, and mostly they're fine. If you got a grade of 1, which a couple of you did, it means I can't open your assignment. So go back, please, and resubmit it in a format that I can open it. I don't know what it is that sometimes people turn in that I can't open. What I can open are PDFs and Word documents. And I think sometimes you can paste into the assignment. Um, Sometimes you do it and it goes like one line all the way across. Try not to do that. That would be my preference. But a couple of you on either the unit question or the document assessment turned in something I can't open. So if your grade's 1, that's what that, or 1 or 0. If it's a 0, I just put in zeros if you didn't turn anything in. It doesn't mean you can't still turn something in. You probably could. But if you have a 0, that means there's some assignment that you did not turn in. Also, one of the things that I noticed last semester is that people got all the way through the end of the class and didn't realize they had to turn in assignments. I'm not really sure how that happens, but you have to turn in assignments. So please look at the grade section of Blackboard and see what your grades are. I'll finish the other thing today, the document assignment, and I'll be able to do those over the weekend. This weekend I don't have to go out of town and all that sort of stuff this weekend, so I'll just have fun and grade this weekend, so it'll be good. Things in general that I guess I would say about the questions, most of them were fine. Some of them were really short, really short. Now you have to remember, instead of giving you 4 questions, I'm giving you 1. So if the answer to your question's like that long, it's 3 or 4 sentences, that's not enough. It just isn't, because what I need to see is that you learned something fairly substantial, at least figured out where to look up something fairly substantial in your textbook. If you give me 3 or 4 general sentences or kind of repeat some really general thing that I said in class, or something you probably knew before you took the class, that's not good. Yeah, what I want is some evidence. Yes, I am talking about the Unit 1 question. What I want is some evidence that you learned something, that you could have some details that back up your general assertions. Some of you said stuff like, when Europeans encountered Native Americans, they treated them poorly, stole their land, and you guys were really fascinated by the women being able to have premarital sex. So I know that showed up in every answer. So even in the general answers, I think I got women with premarital sex. So, okay, there you go. But I understand your point there. And see, that was a specific example of how their values were different. But specific examples are always what I'm looking for. But if you just have 3 or 4 really general things, no specific examples, maybe not delineating groups of Europeans, groups of Native Americans. And I know that was a big, massive question, but you also didn't have to choose that one, did you? But a couple of you who did a really phenomenal job on that. So good job. But specific examples, always what we're looking for. Also, if you use outside sources, which some of you clearly did, again, my goal is that you use the textbook, and in part because it's a pretty reliable, source. Somebody's asking a question. Sorry, I was looking at it. Where do you see my comments on your work? Yeah, that's tricky for me because I know where I see them. I don't know where you see them. What people told me last semester is that when you go into your grade section and you click on the individual grade, that the comments will show up in the rubric section. That's where I put the comments. So if you can click on the rubric section, when you click on your individual grade, I believe that's where the comments are. And I definitely made comments on everything that I graded. Even if it was really, really good, I just said, it's almost perfect. Good job. Or I think somebody's like, I really wish you would have done this, but everything else was so good. I would feel bad taking points away. So, which does happen from time to time. I do say so from time to time, but everybody gets a comment. So if you can't see a comment, you're not looking in the right place. Click on the rubric. I think that's where you look. So click on the grade, and then hopefully there's a section where you can look at the rubric, and that's where I put the comments, unless I made a mistake and then put them in the general comment section. If you have a yellow exclamation point next to your work, I have no idea what that means. Sorry that I'm probably answering your individual question. Every once in a while, I will highlight something in yellow that I think you should have capitalized, or, if you use the wrong word or something like that, I would never, ever. Oh, okay. Yeah, if it's I haven't graded the document thing yet. I haven't graded that. So, except for the one or two people that either didn't turn it in or I couldn't read it, I couldn't open it, then I at least put a comment like I gave you a 1, and I put a comment that I couldn't open your submission. So yeah, I'm not done grading. No. There's how many of them? 70? So yeah. Or 35 of each one. So I'm getting there. Yeah, but I'll finish today. Next weekend, I'll get them done earlier. But again, specific examples. That's really what I'm looking for. So, not just opinions, specific examples from the textbook. I think I was saying that if you're using outside sources, at the very least, paraphrase them. Don't use word for word. There are some of you that are using, I don't know why you always find outside sources that seem to have British English, but there's certain words that is like, we don't say that in the United States. But I also know too that, some, not everybody's from the United States. Maybe some of you grew up in England. Last semester I made a comment on there. I was like, why are you using all these British phrases? And they said, my wife's from England. And I went, oh, okay, then it makes sense. Or, that happens. But if you submit an answer and there are words in there you don't understand, it's not your work, okay? So make sure that everything in your answer makes sense to you. Put it in your own words at the very least, okay? And if I think that you've copied directly from a source, I'll put, the URL of that source. There were a couple of you that I really think borrowed quite liberally from some online sources. And I made some comments about how things really need to be in your voice or in your own words. If you got some of those comments, you're not alone, if that makes you feel any better. But ideally, you're using your textbook. There's headings in the textbook. Textbook's written in pretty clear, accessible English. It's also written by a guy that we trust, not some online source who's unnamed, that sort of thing. So yeah, we like Dr. Foner. We trust him. So yeah. All right. Okay. All right. So I'll keep grading. You guys can keep asking about grades. Also, oh, the other thing. The answer about why did the people in the Chesapeake start using slavery, you're supposed to use the book. Yeah, that's the whole idea. These questions really, when I made these questions, I either revised them from the textbook questions. Did you notice there are questions at the end of each chapter? Or I just looked at the book and wrote a questions like, they can use the book to answer this. So yeah, I really expect that you use the book. Yeah, that's the whole idea. But on the question about why did the people in the Chesapeake stop using slaves, I told you every time I talked about that question that you really needed to talk about Bacon's Rebellion in your answer. I said that every time I talked about it. And about half of you that did that didn't mention Bacon's Rebellion. You didn't. So you said you repeated some general things from my notes, not really anything from the book, and you didn't mention Bacon's Rebellion. that suggests a couple of things to me, which I probably shouldn't even say because you're probably not paying attention, but that's it. You're not paying attention when I go over stuff. Let's say that you don't want to listen to me. You just click on and then you go off and wash dishes, change the baby, do whatever you got to do. You're not paying any attention to me. You just log on and go mow the lawn, whatever you do. But you still want to get some points on the questions. Here's what you look for in the recording when the question is up on the screen. So when the question's up on the screen, that's when I'm talking about the question. So at the very least, go back and look at the section where I'm talking about the question to see what I say. Oh, if I were you, I'd be sure that I use this example in my answer, because it does kind of irritate me if I tell you like 3 times you've got to use a certain example and then you don't use that example. And I know what some of you are thinking, well, what if I turned it in before you went over it? You didn't. Yeah, because I know when you turned it in. It says when you turned it in. So don't tell me stuff like that. I know that's not what went on. No, I get it. I know it's hard. I know I'm maybe even I don't pay attention the entire time, but go back and look at the recording, look at the section where the questions are up on the screen. That'll be the point where I'm talking about the questions, which we'll do here in a little bit, if I can find the questions. Yeah, oh my gosh, technology. All right, why does Word have to get corrupted in the middle of the class? What the heck? All right, I feel like I'm done talking about that. Hopefully that didn't sound too much like I was scolding you. Did it sound bad? I know, you're grown. Most of you, and even if you're not grown, you're close, you're taking a college class. Should I be yelling at you? Probably not. All right, let me try to upload the questions really quick. Oh, and I put it, I can't create stuff in Word right now because something corrupted Microsoft Office. So, and you know that I have no idea how to fix that. You know that. I know you know that, even though we don't know each other that well. I uploaded your document assignment in the assignments page, but I did it as a PDF. So hopefully you can read it. So if you guys will check that, and I'll show you that here in a few minutes, but if you can check that and make sure you can open it, that would be great. Okay, I already forgot what I was looking for. Oh yes, the questions. The questions. Oh gosh. Summer. There it is. All right. Excuse me. I know you're so glad right now that you logged on so you could see me making faces at my computer. All right. Questions are opening, hopefully. Goodness, that looks promising. All right. Let me go back to see if we can open them. Yeah, on the document, I put the full document in there, and the link to the full document in case you want to look at it. Oh, the one that I uploaded as a PDF is for week 3, so, or unit 3, so it's not so urgent, but I may still show it to you. This week's is Washington's farewell address, which we'll definitely talk about as we get to, oh crud, that's from chapter 8 though, so we'll talk, maybe I should talk about that sooner. All right, let me see if I can open the weekly or unit questions. I know I've got to stop calling them the weekly questions because I know that's distressing to at least one of you because it confuses you. That's not what my goal is, I promise. Yeah, so you really just need to read the part on the page for the Washington thing. The next one, the third one, I think I think I had you use something from the textbook on the third one. So if you don't have the textbook, you should probably make a friend. You know what I'm saying? All right. So questions. Oh, we did talk about these yesterday, didn't we? Compare the relative advantages of the British military and the American military. How was Washington able to secure a victory over the most powerful nation in the world? Oh, I have the book on the wrong page because I was working on your Unit 3 stuff yesterday. So as far as page numbers, I know we didn't necessarily put page numbers in there, but let's slide some in. That's also, on the ones that I put on the screen, if I put page numbers in there, I know it doesn't save to your version of the document. However, you could write it down. Wouldn't be terrible. You could do it. You could do it. I would say, I don't know that there's a good page number for this one. I know, I was just saying, well, I'll give you a page number. And then it's like, yeah, maybe not. There's a lot of stuff in there. I would probably start by talking about why they picked Washington as the leader of the Continental Army. So maybe start around page 196, where they talk about that. And I guess 195 and 196, where it talks about the outbreak of the war, and then you probably should talk as well about the, it talks about how Washington was able to kind of stave things off during the first years of the war. He had a couple of early victories, not very many, Trenton being the big one. So I think I would go like 206 to 208 then maybe. And then, does it bother you that I just put a 6 there? And those are probably the most important sections, but I mean, everything about the war probably is useful. Remember that their relative advantages of the British is, they have the biggest military in the world, most powerful, most modern. They certainly had practiced quite a bit at this point, and they were used to global conflict. The big advantage for the Americans is, the home field. They're in their own area. They know the territory a little better. They're also going to use more flexible fighting strategies. They're going to combine traditional military strategies, European military strategies, with maybe more local military strategies. They're willing to retreat, hide behind trees from time to time, do things that Europeans are going to see as ungentlemanly or cowardly, that sort of stuff. So Washington understands that his goal really is not to appear gentlemanly or to follow tradition, but to win the war. Also because Washington had fought in the French and Indian War with varying levels of success, not so much at first and then more as time went along. He also learned British military strategy and tactics and saw their strengths and weaknesses, so was able to combat some of those things as well. Also, Washington's going to encamp with his troops at Valley Forge and other unpleasant places. So he'll build camaraderie with his troops. So the things they're going through, he's going through as well, which isn't always as true of the British military commanders, who sometimes have their troops in pretty bad camps, and they've confiscated, the wealthy person's mansion, and they're staying there for the winter. So, and also, you can always talk about the cause, but the advantage of the military is probably flexibility for the Americans. And, he also has, in local militia, he's able to tap into resources in whatever colony or eventually state that he's fighting in, where, the British have the logistics of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, which is tricky. It is tricky. All right. So you should be able to, yeah, I think you'll be all right on there. Of course, specific examples are always good. I do think I would talk about Battle of Saratoga and gaining the French alliance. You may want to mention the Marquis de Lafayette working and planning with George Washington, the book up a little bit. And honestly, that section of the book is pretty brief. So it's not like you're gonna have to read 8 million pages with lots of detail. And you've already looked at the book, so you know they have a lot of cool maps in there as well. So when you're looking through the chapter, it shouldn't be terribly painful as you look through there. As far as today's question, how do women react to the language of freedom and liberty? There's a pretty specific section in there that talks about how women reacted to the language of freedom and liberty. So that should be pretty helpful to you. I'm looking for page number really quick. Yeah, so if you start on page 245, and when I say to be sure to include Abigail Adams' response and Voices of Liberty, that's a little section right there in your chapter. So be sure to do that. Yeah, be sure to do that. We'll talk about it a little bit today. So it's 245 to, it's really kind of end of the chapter on this one, so 251. So not super long either. Yeah, these will be nice questions. Not like that crazy question about the Native Americans. That thing was long, wasn't it? All right, and then upcoming questions tomorrow and Thursday. How did the framers of the Constitution balance competing claims of local self-government, sectional interest, national authority, and who was John Marshall? John Marshall's like one of my favorite early American dudes. What makes him significant in U.S. history? Discuss specific writings, events, or court cases in your discussion. I like Abigail Adams too, and George Washington. Don't be upset. All right. So there you go. Okay, water in a glass that doesn't have a hole. All right, let me see if I can reopen. I've noticed with the Google, what is that thing, Google Drive? I can't have more than one document open at once though. Yep, there's nothing open. All right, let me look for the notes again. Shouldn't be too hard, right? Oh my goodness. I gotta fix Word. I have no idea. I know I'm gonna end up going to some person that'll charge me more than I paid for the computer. All right, old people. All right, and we may have a pause in the middle where I take roll because I haven't, so sorry. Okay, revolution within. So what we're talking about today in chapter 6 is what happens after we gain our independence. And sometimes you'll notice this if you study lots of revolutions, which I don't know why you would, but it's possible. The gaining of the revolution of the, sorry for the big yawn, the gaining of the independence, winning the war is sometimes a little harder than setting up the freedom, you know, or the new government. So setting up the new government is sometimes pretty tricky because what you find out is, you know, everybody wanted to win. Not everybody wanted to win for the same reasons. Not everybody's vision of the new country, what's important is going to be the same. So this can be a little tricky, and it was. And this is also sometimes where you go into a second revolution, which does happen from time to time. Usually when people talk about the second revolution, they're kind of talking about the writing of the Constitution in US history, that sort of thing. So you could also, I didn't even think about this, the beginning of the chapter talks a little bit about Abigail Adams as well. And sorry for the yawn, about the exchange of letters between Mr. and Mrs. Adams, Abigail and John. And Mrs. Adams, Abigail Adams, was a well-educated woman. And I know sometimes we think, well, women weren't really educated during that time period, and that may or may not be true. Formally educated, honestly, not very many people were formally educated during that time period. If you lived in a Puritan colony, which they were from Massachusetts, yeah, you're more likely to have gone to school, become literate because, Puritans, they set up this foundation of everyone needing to know how to read, whether they were male or female, because you know the Bible, and that's how you're supposed to learn about God, and God's important. So they established public schools so you could learn how to read. And even though the colony becomes more secular pretty quickly, I mean, they're not all just reading the Bible at this point, of course. Um, One of the benefits of being in the colony with this background is that you have a pretty even level of public education. Now, Abigail Adams' dad was a minister, and he had a very large library, also believed that she should be as educated as other people. So she had a pretty strong and unusual education, not just for women, but also for men and the time period. And I think even studied a little bit of Latin and Greek, which wouldn't have been unusual for a minister. So, or in her instance, a minister's daughter. And of course, her husband was a really well-established lawyer, not when he started, he was just a lawyer when he started, but a well-read fellow as well. So they communicated to each other through literary devices. They understood also that their letters that they wrote to each other during the Revolutionary period, where they were often separated, that those letters would become historical artifacts. So they're sort of interesting, I think, in that when you look at those documents, they're not just a letter from a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. They are those letters, but they're also what these two assumed would someday likely become public documents. So, and it mentions too that they make allusions or references to Shakespeare in their letters. So they're a little nerdy. We'll just go with that. Yeah, but it works for them. Mrs. Adams also kind of managed their business interest, and most of the Adams family, the more famous business interest, of course, would be Sam Adams and his beer. Most of the Adams businesses did go bankrupt because they didn't manage their money well. Abigail Adams apparently was a pretty astute money manager as well. She tended to apparently take care of the financial affairs for the family, which seemed to be a good thing, given kind of the history or record of how that family seemed to do. What else did I want to say about Miss Adams? Oh, she liked politics. So she's always paying attention to politics. And during Continental Congress, it mentions that she started talking about the evils of slavery, and how it doesn't make sense to be fighting for liberty but enslaving folks. And then also to remember that also women don't have very many rights. And she's going to write the very famous Remember the Ladies letter, which is part of what you're going to read if you answer that question. Yeah, in the Voices of Liberty section. So, and then of course, she's going to talk about the general things that people are distressed about, taxes and things like that as well. All right. So as far as equality, the book starts to talk about the dream of equality. And then, of course, you see this in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which of course he changed from John Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Paine's quote that they use in this section is that, let's see, he desires to be understood that a perfect equality of rights, the floor of freedom is as level as water. So that everyone, the same way that equality before the law, equality, freedom, being treated equally should just be like an element, water and air and things like that. It should be something that people should expect. And, the assumption might be that it should be something white men should expect, at least among some of these white men. But there's certainly people talking about how that expectation should have moved beyond white men at this point, or should be moving beyond white men at this point. So that's a fairly open discussion that happens at the founding of our country, before the founding of our country, that I know some of you going, it took a long time, and it's still, I know it's not quite complete, is it? But yeah, that's certainly an in-process discussion that starts way back. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. They talk about the common sense, Declaration of Independence, all of the people who kind of center around Philadelphia and the Sons of Liberty, and all of the ideas that they are sharing. Benjamin Rush, who's fairly famous in the founding group, Second Continental Congress, especially that drafting of the Declaration of Independence. So that's the clearest statement of what they thought freedom should be, but certainly they're arguing about lots of other things. And one of the things that you start to see is each state individually has their own constitution that's adopted during this time period as well. Now, before this, probably there'd been a colonial charter, which had been revised a few times during the colonial period. And then those would maybe serve as part of the model, excuse me, but the goal here is to make statements about where people get their rights and what the essence of a republic is. So the object of a republic is going to be promote the public good. So there are going to be statements about maybe how we determine what the public good is and who gets a say in what the public good is. So again, lots of writing during this time period. This is an unusual sort of revolution, I suppose, where everybody does share their ideas, usually in editorials or letters that are published. And it talks quite a bit about John Adams and his writing. And what you start to see is the development of state constitutions that either include ideas of one house legislatures or two house legislatures. Two house legislatures are more common than the single house legislature. It mentions the single house legislatures were in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Vermont. Sometimes they gave governors the power to veto certain laws. Sometimes they did not. But most of the states really wanted most of the power to rest within the legislature because they wanted to avoid a George III-like situation where there might be one guy who's a little out of control, either personally or governmentally. He is assuming too much power and not operating in the best interest of the people. So the goal here is to make sure that the directly elected officials who most closely represented the people had the most say in the laws that were made. And those people were the folks in the legislature. So not that people didn't directly elect the governor, they did, but there's one governor to represent all of the people. In the legislature, you have, one person for your district, whatever your district is defined to be. So part of the reason that most states' constitutions picked the two-house legislature was to give a variety of levels of representation. Sometimes those three states that we mentioned, sometimes people in those states saw the two-house legislature as a relic of the upper house and the lower house, the House of Lords and House of Commons, where they didn't really believe that it was fair to have one constituency with better representation because they were wealthier. And then there's a big discussion about who gets to vote. So they don't exactly do universal suffrage, where everyone gets to vote or every man gets to vote. But they typically have some sort of property right um, that, or a tax that you have to pay if you want to vote. So the expansion of the franchise is in this era to all men who can either pay a tax or own a small amount of property. There's some discussion about how you don't want everyone to vote because not everybody's serious, not everybody's literate, not everyone pays attention, that sort of thing. But for the government to decide who's serious and literate and pays attention is also problematic. They eventually decided that if you were serious enough as a citizen to own property and pay and or pay taxes, that would likely be enough to allow you to vote. In some states, you know, you're more likely to be able to vote as long as you're a free man. In most states, there's going to be a claim of economic independence that's required for you to be able to vote during that era. See, what else did we want to say? So that's also where they start to talk about a separation of church and state during this era, and if there should be a religious test for you to be able to vote or participate in government. They, in general, decide not to have a religious test. And whatever the differences had been between Catholics and Protestants, you maybe start to see a little bit of a softening of that during this era. There had been frustration with the British government because of the Quebec Act, because they allowed Catholic traditions to continue. And there's a quote in there from Benedict Arnold about how that's part of the reason that he felt like he really needed to leave the Americas, because it felt like they were making an unholy alliance with the enemy of Protestantism. So there is certainly still some anti-Catholic sentiment during this time period. And I think, let's see, it says if America's first Roman Catholic bishop was John Carroll of Maryland, and that he had a friendly relationship with other founders during that time period. So you'll start to see really more of a not a meshing of the religions, but more of a tolerance of the different versions of Christianity. So yeah, that's part of this separation of church and state idea in general. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson will write the bill establishing religious freedom for his state in Virginia. And that's where he gives the quote about how it really causes him no harm if his neighbor has one God, 20 gods, or no gods. And what this concept does is it eliminates the idea of a religious test for service within the government. So you don't have to, you know, be of a certain religion, have any religion at all, to serve within the government and to have your rights protected, that sort of thing. And later on, you'll see a bit of a reflection of that in the First Amendment. There's certainly not anything that specifically says there's a separation of church and state within the Constitution, but the concepts are enshrined, and also the First Amendment, which says that the government can't promote or what is the word that I'm looking for? It can't promote and it can't prohibit religion. You know, that it shouldn't be backing it, but it also shouldn't be stopping it. And so mostly the religious protections in the United States are as long as your religion isn't harmful to other people. And I don't mean like it makes you have Catholic guilt or something like that. I mean that it doesn't physically cause harm to people or break laws, things like that, then you should be able to practice that religion. And that people from different religions should not be prevented from serving in Congress, in the military, that sort of thing. All right, so anti-Catholic sentiments still there a little, but you see it kind of being pushed away because of the unity that was developed during the Revolution. And Jefferson, the little Thomas Jefferson's accomplishments section there, they do point out in the book that when Jefferson passes away, he wants on his tombstone that he was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and that he wrote the bill establishing religious freedom. Leaves out his presidency, Louisiana Purchase, lots of other interesting and important things that he does, but he sees these things as his biggest accomplishments. Declaration, founding the University of Virginia. So, you know, a fine institution of learning that's accessible to more modest people of more modest means, a state university, and this bill establishing religious freedom. Also, I didn't mention, and probably should have, it wasn't uncommon in the colonial period for the colonies to have a tax that supported the local church or paid the local minister's salary. Those things are going to go away during this period as well. So if there were still any states that did that, this is the era where that goes away. So there were instances in the colonial period where the state directly supported the church. That was especially true in Puritan colonies initially, because the assumption is if you were in a Puritan colony, you were a Puritan. And if you weren't, you were still going to support their church. And because their church was pretty central to their community, you know, it's where they had political meetings as well. And oftentimes it's the same building they had their schools in. Everybody's tax dollars were going to support not only that church and that building, but also the minister from that church. That's going to change during this era. Okay, all right. So one of the things that it mentions also as far as religion is that the revolution really enhances the diversity of the religious movements within the United States. So there's a whole lot of churches, and there's going to be more and more denominations that develop during this time period. And then you'll see people talk about, Samuel Adams is the one who talked about the United States as a Christian Sparta, where you've got kind of your religion and your values and the nation all sort of intertwined. So there is kind of a union a little bit, perhaps, of church and not state, but like patriotism that you see a little bit during the American Revolution. And I know many of my friends who are not from the United States will often note that we seem to think that patriotism is part of our religion, you know, that you see flags all over the place, but you also see flags in churches, and that union of not church and state, but religion and patriotism sometimes seems a little odd to them. And so this idea of a Christian Sparta, I think, is kind of the beginning of that discussion. Now, certainly, you know, we talked before about how Quakers really aren't going to support any sorts of movements that involve war, so that you know, there are going to be religions that reject that idea, or versions of Christianity that reject that idea. But this is also an era where the Revolutionary era and the early American period is where there's a huge promotion of what they refer to as virtue, civic virtue. And civic virtue is a combination of things that are going to lead to probably some important changes in the Americas, but also lead to some things that will look a little odd, maybe, and probably still feel a little odd to you if you were raised in the United States and went to church here, or not church here, but went to school here, and notice that there are certain things that seem like like you say the pledge every day, that kind of thing. Now, I know some of you are like, no, she doesn't like the pledge. I'm not necessarily saying that. The pledge is lovely. It's fine. I mean, it's good. I like the flag. Yesterday was Flag Day. Flag Day. It was. I didn't even mention that, did I? But I don't know. Do other countries have Flag Day? But the concept of of virtue during this time period is the idea that you have to be willing to have self-sacrifice for public good, that we are creating a nation here that's based on ideas, that's not based on race or ethnicity, but it's based on the concept of freedom. And I know some of you are going, it's not, it's only loosely based on the concept of freedom. But it's a basis of freedom that grows over time. And what is it that Lincoln says that, is it Lincoln that's, no, who is it that says, oh, no, that was um, in Brown versus Board of Education, where they talked about the promise of that the principle of our Constitution will be realized. But, Lincoln certainly mentions that too during the Civil War. But what we have is a list of goals to aspire to that are created in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And our idea of civic virtue is that we're always constantly working toward perfecting those goals. And so civic virtue is going to include ideas of not necessarily religion, but kind of moral values that everyone can agree on, which founders are going to say are really hard to separate from religion. But the idea of doing good things, doing things that don't harm other people, and of course, things that are often codified in law. You don't steal things from other people, you don't kill people, that sort of thing. But also, we want to make sure that people learn these principles, and we can't just rely on the church to do that. So, northern states in particular want to create public schools where students are taught the principles of freedom. And you can have a general diffusion of knowledge, as the Texas Constitution says, so that people can become good and proper citizens. So we want you to go to school so you can be a good and proper citizen, so you can learn, what our country's founded on, how you can support those beliefs, how you can improve the application of those beliefs, that sort of stuff. But if you don't know anything about our history and our political background, then you won't know any of this stuff. So we got to make sure you know these things. I think it's part of why you are either reluctantly in this class right now or excitedly in this class right now, because somebody somewhere still in a legislature thinks that your education, even though you're all going to be doctors, lawyers, and engineers, your education is not complete without a basic knowledge of US history, government, and politics, which is why you have at least 6 classes in our fine branch of the college, even though you probably don't want 6 classes from us. Shame, shame, shame. But if you don't know how the government works, if you don't know how the history of how the government was devised, then you can't understand where it came from and how you need to improve it. So this idea of civic virtue is important to the founders. And these are all highly educated men. They also typically ascribe to some version of Christianity. I probably, Jefferson, with a more loose subscriber, but still, thought that religious belief is really necessary to guide moral behavior. And that, again, is probably not an idea that's as commonly held in the modern era, although we're solidly in the middle of the country, so it's probably fairly common here as well. So these guys, Jefferson, Adams, other founders, think, Benjamin Rush is mentioned specifically in this group as well, think that without public school, that our nation is not going to be strong. Also, if you're not well educated, you might elect people that are A little nutty. Yeah. So you don't want to have, I don't think they called it a little nutty. Let's see what they said in here. Um, because more people are able to vote, they want people to participate in the wise election of representatives. So since we're giving more people a vote, we want more people to be educated so that they can use that voice to make a good decision. All right. I feel like we talked about a lot of things kind of in the list there. All right. And Adams is one of the ones who, I know it just says there, Adams and land ownership. In that discussion of who should get to vote, Adams is one of the ones who really pretty strongly believes that unless you have some sort of financial stake in the country, then you are not going to make good decisions for the finances of the country and the future of the country. So he's one of the ones who strongly believes that some sort of property requirement is important for voting. Now, you've noticed in this era and in the modern era too, that what we decided in this era, and then when we write the Constitution, is that individual states will get to determine certain voting requirements. And that's still true, which is why we're having arguments over voting laws. Even right now, someone is arguing over a voting law somewhere in some state. Texas being one of them, and Texas will even have a special session to go back and discuss voting requirement changes, that sort of thing. All right. Let's see. I was just kind of talking about stuff. Let me peek at the book and see if there are things in here that we should talk about that I sort of overlooked. Oh, talks a little bit about economic freedom during this time, during this section, which is probably a little bit about the John Adams kind of thing, but let's see. Hope that every member of society could acquire land. Yeah, their thought during this era, except for Alexander Hamilton, which you probably sing about. You probably sing about him. Almost all the other founding fathers thought that the best way to promote equality in the new country was to make sure that everyone was a landowner. So that this needed to be a nation essentially of small farmers or maybe small businessmen, because you had to have a few businesses, but essentially a nation of small farmers, because then everybody would have an equal amount of wealth or an equal possibility of wealth, because again, part of the way that this European tradition believed that you gained wealth was by owning land. And if you didn't have access to land, then you weren't going to have economic independence. The book also talks about how you start to see a move away from primogeniture during this time period. And one of the things that Jefferson said that he was proudest of was limiting inheritance to like certain members of the family, just primarily the eldest son, because that essentially ensured that only the eldest son would be financially independent and everybody else had that possibility of being a pauper, of being really poor. So the idea that families should divide land up among their descendants so that everyone had an ability to gain the minimum idea there was, at least for Jefferson, was 50 acres of land. I think what we eventually sort of settle on, for whatever reason, is 40 acres of land. But that seemed to be the minimum amount of land that people thought during that time period would help you maintain economic independence. And of course, we're still followers of the ideas of capitalism, free trade, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations ideas during that time period. And the argument there is that the free market would be the invisible hand that kept things in check, that directed economic life, supply and demand. That's essentially part of the, yeah, to me in the modern era, owning 40 acres of land Sounds like a terrible idea. Mowed the lawn over the weekend. That's enough land for me, the lawn. But, I come from a tradition of farmers in the Midwest, a few generations back, and I think it was my great grandfather had probably about 40 or 50 acres, which seemed enormous, but for a farm is really small. And if it's probably enough to have subsistence farming to get along, to support yourself, have some food, sell your excess crops, and buy the things that you needed. That's not going to make you wealthy, unless maybe it's 40 acres and it's a vineyard or something. No, that's not even enough for a good vineyard. And I think if you come from a farming or ranching background, quite a ranch, 40 acres isn't even close to enough for a ranch, but it's way more than I would ever want to mow, for sure. All right. I think now is a really good time for a break so that I can take roll. So let me stop for a second. Stop sharing so I can look at your faces. You pause the recording. All right, thanks for the little roll pause. What should we look at? Go back to the notes? Yeah, we could go back to the notes. That'd be good. Hopefully we can go back to the notes. Let's see. Can we? Yes, we can. All right. So U.S. policy toward Native Americans. Yeah, U.S. policy toward Native Americans. Tricky stuff, maybe, kind of, sort of. Yeah, and the book talks about, where we limit the idea of liberty. One of the ways we limit liberty is toward loyalists. People were not very excited about loyalists. They continually re-educated them. And some of these guys were really poor. Some of these guys were really wealthy. The ones who are really wealthy were going to be harassed the most. The book mentions most of the loyalists are in, it says the British loyalists serving with the British outnumbered Washington's army. So there were a lot of loyalists. So mostly in, it said New York, Pennsylvania, and the back country of the Carolinas and Georgia, so coastal areas. Some of them were very wealthy people and professional people who really didn't think the United States would have a chance to win. And if they did, that it would be a really lawless nation. And some of them were poorer people who just thought, an economic change like that would cause them bigger problems. Some of the loyalists are going to move somewhere else. Some of them are going to move farther west. It's not terribly uncommon for loyalists to go to Canada, and they're sometimes perceived as lesser British citizens because they lived in the Americas. Sometimes they will go to England if they have some money, and they'll be perceived kind of the same way. And sometimes they don't have enough money, so they just have to stay. And they're going to be harassed just a little bit. If they have property, it's probably going to get confiscated. So people were not fond of loyalists during that time period. Sometimes let's see, the loyalists left, and then there started to be a discussion about the borders and Native Americans, not because the loyalists left, but that's the next section in the book. So some Native American leaders thought that perhaps there could be a confederacy of Native American groups, that they could have a league, a loose league of friendship, like you're going to see with the Articles of Confederation, where the Native Americans worked together to promote their own interest. But the thought was, if natives where do natives have the right to maintain their own land? And so there are going to be some native groups who will form confederacies and actually appeal to the US government and use some Enlightenment terminology talking about their natural rights, asking if, they had ever done anything to forfeit their independence and natural rights, mentioning that they had lived there for longer than the Europeans had lived there, and apparently they had a natural right to that territory. It was not uncommon for states during this time period to establish what they called guardianship over Native Americans and say that they had a certain area that they could stay in. It's kind of an early version of the reservation system. I don't know why I couldn't get that word out of my head there. The reservation system. And now Native Americans are going to have to try to figure out how to preserve their own freedom in a legal sense, in ways they hadn't had to do before. So you will start to see Native American groups, whether they're nations or confederacies, devising constitutions, having written documents, trying to work within the new US legal system to maintain not only their rights, but their land. What the general consensus is about Native Americans is, excuse me for the yawn, that they are deserving of certain rights, but that those rights are not going to be equal to the rights of the white citizens in their area. So the best thing, according to white citizen governments in the United States, is for Native Americans to move farther west. That way they can have some land and maintain their independence, but it won't be the land that the whites in the East want to have. So what you will start to see is a discussion of how Native Americans need to just move farther west. So it's going to be essentially some push for displacement, westward movement for Native Americans. What happens very quickly once we get presidents and things like that is there starts to be the development of a Native American policy, which is removal, that Native Americans need to relocate west of the Mississippi River. Now, it's a little early to be that well defined in this era, but that's where that is headed. There's no permanent place for Native Americans any longer in the eastern part of our present country or in the United States. So the tricky part of this as well is it's very clear from what the descendants of Europeans who are now the leaders of the United States, it's very clear that what they've done over time is they've taken land in the East and then taken more and more and more land progressively. And there's no reason to think that that pattern is going to change in any way, because it's not. Yeah, no, that's very clear. So yeah, that's the way that's going to go. All right. So more cheery stuff. Slave ownership increases between the Revolution and 1800, even though there's an increasing discussion of freedom during this time period. And it mentions that it's funny because, not funny, but the book talks about how in the language of American patriots that Britain is a kingdom of slaves, and America, what becomes the United States, was a country of free men. However, it's clear that in the country of free men, there's a large percentage of those states that have slaves. And it's clearly a contradiction in the idea of freedom that you could own slaves and consider yourself a purveyor of freedom. But there's going to be a lot of discussion during this era about how slavery is wrong. However, you're not going to see a lot of people in southern states who own slaves who think, well, now is the time to free these slaves. So the book talks about some of the obstacles to abolition. One of the biggest obstacles to abolition is that in the southern states, very high percentages of the population are enslaved, and the people who own those slaves run the government. So it mentions Thomas Jefferson had more than 100 slaves. At the time that he wrote that everyone has unalienable rights to liberty. But for financial reasons, these folks are not going to be very interested in freeing their slaves. You'll notice that people with Quaker traditions, people with Puritan traditions are much less likely to be okay with slave ownership. There's going to be petitions for emancipation, freedom petitions in early governments by enslaved African Americans. And they're going to note that it seems very contradictory that a country that values its own freedom thinks that owning people is okay. So there will be, very vocal, public, legal discussions about these things. What you'll notice is some of the northern states will begin to make slavery illegal. There's more voluntary emancipation in certain states, somewhat in the middle, the Chesapeake region. And abolition in the North is going to be a much more common sort of thing. But part of it's a slower process. It's usually gradual emancipation, where they either determine a year that slaves will be freed or an age that slaves will be freed, like everybody got freed when they were 21. So you'll start to see the beginnings of gradual emancipation in the North. You'll see pretty strong discussions among founding fathers who own slaves and founding fathers who don't, about the contradictory nature of that. But, the truth just is that wealthy people in the South are not going to want to relinquish their wealth. You will see some of some people in the Chesapeake region free their slaves. As a rule, the farther south you go, the less likely it's going to be that you'll see that. It mentions, again, more abolition in the North, but you would like to think that that's completely because they thought it was wrong, but it's also in part because their economy is not nearly as reliant upon slaves. And then the book will mention that there are lots of free Black communities, that you see these really more in the upper South Chesapeake region. Virginia and Maryland is where you see most of those. You'll see some in some southern states, but let's see, it says all states except Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. In all these states, free Black men also maintain the right to vote as long as they owned property. But in southern states, it's much less, the farther south states, the deep south, it's much less likely that African Americans are going to gain their freedom. And if they do, they're not going to have the right to vote. So part of the reason that you see slave ownership increase, I guess we didn't necessarily answer the question, we walked all the way around it, is because the plantations become more successful in the South, because the living conditions for the slaves on those plantations are allow them to survive. I'm not saying that it's a great place to live. I'm just saying they don't die. And because slave owners own the children of the slaves, so whether they reproduce in slave families or whether the women are assaulted and raped and forced to reproduce, those children also are owned by the owner of the plantation. So you have natural increase, and you have safe enough conditions that people live long enough to reproduce. So you're going to see just a natural population increase during this time period. And even though there's an increasing number of people who gain their freedom during this time period, the vast majority of folks do not. And so population increase and the fact that southern states really are not willing to give up their slaves because their economy is dependent on it. And it's really easy for people. I'm from kind of the middle of the country. I'm from Missouri, which the bottom part of Missouri thought it was a slave state, and the northern part of Missouri thought it was a free state. So Missouri is kind of a picture of the way the country becomes during this time, during the pre-Civil War time period, the antebellum time period. But the states in the North, it's easy for them to claim a higher morality because they didn't have slaves. They had economic systems that didn't rely on slaves as much. So, and I'm not going to be one of I would not argue that, that the way the North treated their immigrant employees was equal to the way the South treated slaves, because they're both bad, but I can't imagine that anybody thinks being treated poorly and having, a terrible place to live is the same as somebody owning you. But both are bad, but one doesn't justify the other, I think, is kind of where I'm at it on that. All right, but slave ownership increases in the South because the number of slaves from natural reproduction or unnatural reproduction, women being assaulted and raped and having children as a product of that, also increases during that era. So, but there's a very open discussion about the immorality and inconsistency of slavery, from before the founding of our nation. So that's a discussion that continues during this time period. And then, you have the very famous poet, Phillis Wheatley, who's mentioned during this time period. And she is kind of she's one of the not very many people, I think, are able to make a living as a writer ever. Like, I don't know. I don't think I know anyone. No, I've probably met a person or two that they earn a living as a writer. But I don't know very many people. And most of us in our day-to-day lives probably don't know anyone who makes a living as a writer. So Phillis Wheatley's unique in that she makes a living as a writer. She's a poet. You're probably more likely to make a living as a poet back in those days. And I think she lived in Boston. I should know. I'm sure she lived in Boston. But Phillis Wheatley was also African American woman. So she's going to write mostly about, things that she would be familiar with, her family and Christianity and the incompatibility of Christianity and slavery. So she is a very famous poet who makes a living during that time period as a poet and is, embraced by lots of readers during that time period. Says that she wrote, 1783, The Cruel Fate of Being Snatched from Africa's Shores. So, and she was brought as a slave to the Boston area, gained her freedom, and then writes primarily about her love of freedom. Let's see. So she learned to read, published her first poem when she was in 1765, when she was 12 or around 12. But it also mentions too that part of the reason that she gained some fame and notoriety and was able to make a living as a writer is that she's endorsed by a bunch of famous white people who are going to attest to her intellect. Because if you've read any of Jefferson's notes on Virginia, it's pretty commonly believed during this time period that African Americans, people of African descent, don't have the same cognitive abilities as people who are white. It's also, there's a lot of writing during this time period about the difference between whites, Blacks, and Native Americans, and how you know who was most intelligent, most capable of freedom, of managing freedom, that sort of thing. And it wasn't uncommon for white intellectuals during this time period to see people like Phyllis Wheatley or Benjamin Banneker, who's a city planner and a scientist, and also an African American, as aberrations, as special causes, as unusual for their race. So you'll see a lot of, well, it is racist commentary from educated white people of the time period about how the intellect, the superior intellect of people like Phyllis Wheatley or Benjamin Banneker or I don't know, names are, I'm having trouble with names today. The founder of the AME Church, but prominent African-American intellectuals about how that's just a freak of nature, essentially. So lots of unpleasant things you could read during this time period. As far as role of women during this time period, women certainly participated in boycotts. There are pictures, drawings of women who literally participated in the war effort, who worked either for the women, the British Army or the US Army. Mercy Otis Warren is a fairly prominent local historian of the time period. Abigail Adams is clearly an educated woman who writes quite well and has, you know, unusual academic abilities. But women are not going to gain a lot of political rights during this time period. So, you know, still women are not going to be able to inherit property. They're going to be considered as, by the law, essentially property of their husbands, property of the estate, or at least controlled by their husbands legally. Political freedom for women, right to self-government is not really going to exist. So the marriage contract is going to be more the defining law rather than the social contract for women. So women's freedom and women's rights are really dependent upon the rights that they exercise within their marriage. Legally, you don't really have many rights except not to be harmed, that sort of thing. But because you can't own property, then you really don't have control over your own person. You don't have autonomy. Women, the independence that women might have during this time period would either be gained through their marriage because their husband allowed it, or when their husband died, if they didn't have heirs, then it is possible for women to control property at least while they are alive, but they're not able to inherit property. So that property would have to be passed along to somebody who wasn't, who was male. So women really are not in a good place legally. The book mentions there'll be some Quakers who are going to petition Congress to protest mistreatment of let's see, men who would not take the women are going to protest the mistreatment of Quakers. So they're going to petition Congress from time to time. Certainly Abigail Adams petitioned Congress, but as far as gaining actual rights, women really don't gain any actual rights during this time period. Now, guys like John Adams are going to say that women already rule the world because they rule their husbands. So that is probably a sign of the strength of the Adams marriage, and that Abigail Adams was not only a fairly assertive woman, but she was respected by her husband. So as long as you have a nice husband who respects you, you're in good shape. But not everybody, of course, is going to have that. And it works pretty well for the Adams family because they're also people of means. They have money and that sort of thing, and gives them opportunities that people who are poor don't have. Most of the influence that women have during this era is through their family. and through this idea of promoting virtue and the concept of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood. So it's kind of where we're headed and ending here in a minute. And then we'll look at, what will we look at next? I don't know. Oh, trash day. I hear the trash guy. Maybe we can look at the stuff to study. So concept of Republican motherhood is that women are in charge of the next generation of citizens. So they need to raise them to have this sort of civic virtue that was really important to this generation, to understand the concepts of republicanism, to understand the founding of the government, the basic concepts of the principles of liberty, that sort of thing. So this is going to essentially require that women have some education in that area. So it is going to be not only acceptable, but considered important for women to have a basic education so that they can be good mothers and raise the next generation of young patriots well. So the idea that women need to have education really is so that they can raise their children well. So basic education, being able to read and write, basic principles of government, philosophy, that sort of thing, important to women. But as far as gaining legal status during this time period, not so much. So the power that women really gain during this era is a basic access to education. But the only legal freedoms that they have are freedoms that are granted to them within their marriage. Now, you're also probably thinking, well, they could remain unmarried. They could remain unmarried, and some women did. It's going to be a really small percentage of women that do this. The problem for unmarried women is that they don't have the right to own property. And in an era where property is wealth, that also means it's going to be hard for them to make enough money to survive on their own. So unmarried women typically lived with family members. It is possible in certain maybe urban areas that unmarried women maybe could live together in a boarding house or something along those lines, and that does happen from time to time. But it's very hard for women to gain freedom and independence without being able to own property. So that's going to be an unusual problem for women during this era. They can gain some education, they can gain some status within their marriage, as a wife and as a mother, but outside of the marriage, it's going to be very hard for women to maintain their independence. It's an enormous issue for women during this time period. Or it's not, because the custom is you get married. So it is an enormous issue, but it really guides what those customs are and really limits opportunities that women will have for their adult lives, because outside of marriage, you're not going to be able to own property. Yeah, and owning property is a thing. Now, you kind of end this discussion, this chapter, of people gaining their freedoms and their liberties by saying, did anybody really gain any freedom or any liberty? Yes, but it is a very, very slow process historically. I know I didn't really read an article about, I think it's Kevin Hart, who's some fairly famous guy who's short. That's all I know about him, and he's funny, and he does some commercials a lot about a credit card. But he was frustrated about the political situation, voting rights laws, that sort of stuff, and commented about how we really, apparently, I didn't see the whole thing, but I just saw some people talking about progress that we've made as far as rights, but made a comment in his frustration about something. There's many things we could be frustrated about legitimately, of course, that we really have made no progress toward freedom in our country. And you may have that conclusion at the end of this chapter. It's like, what did we do here? Well, what we did that's a little different than that happened before. More people are able to gain their freedom. who had been enslaved, so middle colonies and above. Black men who gained their freedom are able to own property and vote. And again, it's not even anywhere close to a majority. It's a very small percentage of people, but it's a greater percentage than before. Women really are not making a lot of official gains, but their voices are being, I don't know that they're being heard, but they're being expressed, and women are gaining a right to education. And Frederick Douglass would argue, one of my favorite people in history, would argue that without education, there's no opportunity for freedom. So what you're seeing here is are arguments that are the foundation for something that later on might help make things better. So the progress is really slow. For Native Americans, we hardly ever are going to see anything in US history where you look at it and you go like, well, that was a good thing for Native Americans. They were the folks that are just going to constantly get displaced in the story of US history, because they were the folks who were originally occupying the land, and more people kept coming who were able to push them off. So you'll see times where Native Americans are incorporated within certain states or societies, but it usually is under the guise of guardianship, and then later on they're probably going to be pushed out. I guess our one time where we can say things go well for Native Americans is in Florida with the Seminoles. Beyond that, and then later on, there'll be much later on, late 20th century, you'll see some legal victories. And I think there's some legal stuff moving, to the Supreme Court right now, as far as Native Americans and land ownership, mostly in the West, in sparsely populated areas. But during this time period, I think what you see are foundational things, beginnings of things, continuations of arguments. So you don't necessarily see anything that you go like, no, that was a great change for this group or that group, but you see openings, I suppose. I think that's what we see. All right, let me see if I can find the list of things to study and then share those again. You know that all these things are in the course documents. Yeah. Oh no, we were going to look at the, did you want to look at the document thing, the George Washington thing? We could do that really quick, maybe. I think I saved that. Oh gosh, in the Google Drive. I really don't use the Google Drive as often, so I think I'll be even slower looking up stuff in Google Drive. I'm thankful for Google Drive though, since the other stuff isn't working. Oh, that's not good. Oh, do you guys have any questions? Do you have questions you want to ask? Is there anything you want to ask while I'm struggling to find things? Okay, let me go back to you and then open this. Where are your faces? There are your faces. All right. And I don't know if anybody came in later that I need to adjust the roll, but I don't think so. All right, let's look at the document thing. So for Unit 2, your document thing is the Washington Farewell Address. And I think I just pasted this. Yeah, I did. Okay. An excerpt of it. That's what those dots mean. It's an ellipse. So it means that I took this from the middle of a speech. I don't know what the 7 is there. I don't know if that was a line. In the one that I don't know if the 7 shows up in your version of it either, but there's a link to the full address if you want to see the whole thing, which isn't enormous, but it's, it's a speech. And I think Hamilton wrote this speech. Was it Hamilton or was it Adams? It might have been Adams, but that's also a sign that people had speech writers early. I know we often think that speech writers are kind of a modern thing. I think politicians, especially if they needed to speak well, understood sometimes that wasn't their thing. So they found someone else who they think either was a better speaker or a better writer to write their things. Jefferson was notorious about that, brilliant writer, but a lot of times he would just like write a speech and just hand you a copy and go, here you go. I'm not saying it to you. But You've got a link to the full source and then a background source, the ushistory.org site. I can't remember if it has commercials. If it does, sorry, but it's free. And the Washington's farewell speech is famous for a couple of things. Was this one okay? 3 to 5 sentences. Yeah. No, on this, yeah, this is going to be probably a little shorter because there's a lot of questions. And there was a sample. I did the sample on the I think it was the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. So, you can see that. What I'm really looking for is you to be specific, maybe give some examples, that sort of thing. The Washington's farewell address is famous for a couple of reasons, maybe more than a couple. We'll go with 3. We'll go with 3. There's more than 3, but I'll mention 3. 1, there's nothing in the Constitution during this time period and until after FDR gets elected to 4 terms that limits the number of terms a president can serve. So Washington could literally have been president until he died. There was no way we were going to elect anyone else if Washington was running. Washington chose to walk away after 2 terms, and people saw that as amazing because he could have just continually increased his power and become sort of, like an American king, that sort of thing. And he decided to walk away. And, sometimes people look at that and see that as one of the most important things in US political history. So that's a big deal. So this is his speech after his 2nd term, which he, voluntarily left after the 2nd term, which sets that precedent where, until FDR, presidents only serve 2 terms because, well, that's what Washington did. There'll be a couple of folks in there that'll try to run for more than 2, but FDR is going to be the only one elected to more than 2. And then after FDR gets elected to 4, the Republicans say, oh my gosh, he could have been president forever if he hadn't died. Let's limit it to 2. So they did. The Republicans didn't do that. They initiated the constitutional amendment that was then approved that does that. So now we have a constitutional amendment. All right, so Washington walks away. That's one big thing. There are 2 things, there we go. 2 things that Washington talks about in the speech that are really important, and this excerpt focuses on one of them. The one that it doesn't focus on is about how political parties could potentially be divisive and break up the country. So he warns against political parties. He calls them factions. And thing number 2, which is what this excerpt is about, and you'll read it and go like, I'm not sure that's really what it's about. You may have to read it more than once, like what is he saying? And you may have to read it out loud or something like that. But, oh, and when it says providence with the P, he means God, by the way. What he's talking about here is what sort of alliances should we have with other countries? What other alliances could we have with other countries that would be helpful to us? And so he talks about, he says it right here. Well, and he says, nothing is more essential that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for other should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings toward all should be cultivated. So we shouldn't have like strong, we love this nation, we hate this nation, because that could lead to problems, which here are some problems he lists. Frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contests. There you go. So, which sacrifices peace. So this is his assertion that it doesn't make any sense for our country to be involved in entangling foreign alliances that either get us into wars directly because we dislike a country so much, or indirectly because the nation we do like gets involved in a war with a nation they don't like, so we get pulled in. So our goal really is to be neutral, to stay out of stuff, to not get involved in other people's foreign policies. So, because any nation that we do favor is going to get us pulled into a conflict we don't want to be a part of. A nation we dislike will directly pull us into a conflict because we don't like them. But there's lots of discussion of this. Certainly we want to trade with other nations, but if we trade with one and we have an alliance, it might prohibit us from trading with others. So steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. I do think that even though the language is a little archaic, that it's fairly clear what he's trying to say. Now, in case you're wondering, like, why didn't we stick with that? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? Why we didn't stick with avoiding entangling foreign alliances? Any thoughts? Temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. So Washington tells us we should not get involved. Our foreign policy should not make direct alliances that might get us involved with conflicts, but we clearly have abandoned that. Yes? Yes? No? Maybe? Any thoughts? I think when you answer these questions, if you want to make a you don't have to, but if you want to make a comment about why that's changed, feel free. You don't have to, of course. Your goal on the document-based question, or I did just say that like I was teaching AP US history again. Your goal in the document analysis, let me go back to it, is honestly to answer the questions. So just make sure that you answer all the questions. That'll be most, my biggest concern, and that you answer them correctly as well. Like as far as author of the document, you can say that it's Washington. That's fine. You can also mention that he probably had, someone else help him write it. It's a formal, as far as what sort of document it is, this is a formal speech. I mean, this is a speech that's going to be delivered publicly. So, you want to say that. And when I ask, how does that impact the credibility of the document? You know that in a formal speech, you're going to say something different than you would say, like if you're talking to your cousin on the weekend. So, you're going to have a different sort of language. It's going to be more formal. I'm not saying it's going to be honest or dishonest. It's going to be, the things you talk about in public. So it's going to be, you want to put forth your best impression, that sort of thing. Significance of the document, importance. I wouldn't, sometimes when I ask people to discuss this, they go, well, it clearly has no significance because we just threw it out. Like, well, when did we throw it out? When did we decide we're going to get involved in entangling foreign alliances? Was that, the next day after Washington said this, or was it sometime later? What was the importance of it? That sort of thing. Okay, let me see what your comment is. All right. Yeah, certainly in the modern era, let's see, government has found a way to not let people know they're being, yeah, this was maybe, I don't know, and you wouldn't have to agree with this expression at all. This may have been a bigger issue in the 1960s and 70s when we were more directly overthrowing people's actual leaders. I know that we are indirectly doing stuff the same way other countries are indirectly getting involved through, especially with the use of technology in the modern era. You can mess with all sorts of things through technology without directly sending troops or dropping bombs, or, you can manipulate currency markets, you can lock down oil pipelines apparently, or block meat production and distribution. That's an enormous problem in the United States, isn't it? Or you can interfere in elections. So yeah, there's lots of, In the 60s and 70s, when I was a kid, we just kind of directly did that. Yeah. Before that as well. It's part of the reason we had all the issues with Cuba that we had. So, all right. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate you making a comment as well. I'm not saying other people weren't paying attention. I almost said that, but I don't mean that. All right, I do know that it's getting late, so you guys have probably had enough, haven't you? All right, let me go ahead and stop the recording. So I guess